Odessa Bell Jenkins walked into the bank just another old woman, until she asked for her office. She walked in like she'd done it 100 times before. No hesitation, no stumble, just one slow steady step after another. Odessa Bell Jenkins, 74 years old, skin like sun, dried tobacco leaves and eyes sharp as glass, pushed open the door to Hamilton First Bank in downtown Modesto. Nobody paid her any mind at first. The air conditioning hummed too loud. Phones rang, fingers tapped at keyboards. Odessa wasn't dressed for business. Faded blue dress, worn orthopedic shoes and a wide-brimmed straw hat, like something out of a 1960s Sears catalog slung over one shoulder. A beat-up canvas sack with hand-stitched initials OBJ. She stepped to the center of the lobby and stopped. "Excuse me," she said, her voice low but clear. "I'd like access to my office, please." The young teller at window didn't even look up. "Ma'am, if you're here to make a deposit, you'll need to take a number." "I'm not here to make a deposit." Now he looked. So did the woman beside him, and the assistant manager near the back. The silence that followed wasn't heavy or dramatic, just awkward, like everyone expected her to explain herself, and she didn't feel any rush to do so. "You said your office?" the teller asked, clearly confused. Odessa nodded once. "Top floor behind the frosted glass. Used to be my grandfather's. I'm here to reclaim it." That's when the laughter started. Quiet at first from a young woman near the counter, then a cough, someone clearing their throat, trying to hide it. The security guard raised an eyebrow and leaned forward from his stool. "You own this bank?" the teller asked, amused. "Now, man, this is Hamilton First Corporate Bank, not a diner. You sure you're in the right building?" Odessa didn't blink. Instead, she lowered the sack from her shoulder and set it gently on the tile floor. The zipper was stiff from years of dust, but it slid open without a sound. Out came a folded birth certificate, a stack of parchment-colored documents, a glossy black and white photo of a black man in a double-breasted suit, shaking hands with a white man in front of a building that looked an awful lot like this one. Then she laid down a single page, framed once, now just laminated for age. At the bottom, in fading ink, a signature that still read clearly, H. Hamilton. The lobby went still. The teller leaned over, scanning the page. His face paled. The assistant manager took a step forward, eyes narrowed. "Where'd you get these?" he asked. "My grandfather gave them to me," Odessa replied. "Before he died, he told me to protect them. Said the world would forget, but paper doesn't, Mum. This can't be real." "Is that so?" Odessa tilted her head. "You got a legal department, don't you? Might want to call them." The manager, Mr. Lyles, according to his name tag, came out from behind the counter, older than the rest, maybe mid-50s, hair thinned out, shirt a little too tight at the buttons. "Let's go somewhere private, Miss Jenkins." "Odessa Bell Jenkins." "Miss Jenkins, if this is some kind of mistake, it's not, and I'd prefer we talk up there." She pointed toward the top floor behind the glass panel, same one she'd mentioned earlier. He hesitated, looked around. Finally, he gave a small nod to the security guard. "We'll take her to the conference room." They led her past curious stares and side glances. Odessa walked slow, unbothered. She didn't gloat. She didn't explain herself. Her sack bounced lightly at her side with every step. She wasn't there to prove anything. She was there because something was overdue. But before they reached the elevator, someone asked a question that changed the temperature of the room entirely. "Wait, what exactly is in that bag?" It was the assistant manager, Lyles, who asked. His voice was trying to stay calm, but his tone didn't match his eyes. Odessa stopped mid-step, turned slightly, and looked at him, as if she had been waiting for that question all morning. "Proof," she said simply. "Proof this place doesn't belong to who you think it does." Rare inside the third-floor conference room. The air felt tighter. Maybe it was the low ceiling, or the windows that hadn't been cleaned in months. Or maybe it was the silence that sat between them. As Odessa emptied the rest of the sack onto the long table, she didn't throw things around or make a show of it. She placed each item like it was sacred. One by one, original land deeds, typewritten stock certificates with embossed seals, correspondence between her grandfather, Elijah Jenkins, and Ernest Hamilton, the bank's namesake. Some pages were brittle faded. Others had ink so dark it looked freshly stamped. Lyle stared at the pile. His lips parted, but said nothing. Odessa reached for a document in the center and slid it toward him. Start with that. He picked it up with both hands, like it might fall apart. His eyes skimmed the text. Transfer of controlling interest. Signed 1957. Elijah Jenkins. What is this, the real ownership? Odessa said before Hamilton first became part of Western Consolidated. My grandfather was the largest stakeholder, but the name stayed. They erased him with paperwork. That's impossible. The Jenkins name has never come up in our archives. She shrugged. Not everything makes it into the archives when people want it buried. Lyles rubbed his temple. You're saying your grandfather owned this bank? Why would he hide that? He didn't. He was forced out. Bought out with bad faith terms promised. Shares that were never registered. The merger in '74. That was just a fancy word for theft. The assistant manager opened his mouth to object, but stopped himself. Instead, he pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. I'm calling corporate. Odessa didn't react. She carefully laid down the last document, a notarized affidavit signed by Ernest Hamilton himself, recognizing Elijah Jenkins as co-founder and majority shareholder in the original charter. Lyles turned away, pacing while the phone rang. Yes. This is Joseph Lyles at Modesto Branch 142. We've got a situation. Someone's here claiming ownership rights, going back to the founding. Odessa's hand rested on the table. She wasn't there to argue or beg, just to wait. They've got documents, originals. No, I'm not joking. He listened, eyes shifting back to her. Okay, yes, I'll hold the room. He hung up a minute later. Regional Legal is sending a team over. They'll be here in a couple hours. Odessa nodded. Once, we're also pulling the historic records from the vault downstairs. Lyles added, if this is real, they'll want everything laid out. She smiled just a little. You should have done that years ago. An hour passed, then another. During that time, Odessa spoke little. She looked out the window, mostly occasionally sipping water, brought by a nervous intern, who didn't ask any questions. But people were moving downstairs. Staff who had barely glanced at her earlier were now whispering in corners, peeking up at the conference room window, like it was the scene of a crime. In truth, it wasn't a crime, not in the way they expected. But what Odessa had brought wasn't just paperwork. It was weight, history, memory, ownership, and some folks in that building were starting to feel it press on their shoulders. But what really made the walls shake wasn't what she'd already shown. It was what she hadn't pulled out yet. By the time the regional legal team arrived from Sacramento, 3 sharp suits and a woman with a briefcase, heavier than Odessa's sack, the room had a new tension to it. Odessa remained seated, calm, hands folded in her lap, like she was waiting for Sunday service to begin. The lead attorney, a man named Bryce Hanley, didn't even bother with introductions at first. He dropped his leather-bound binder on the table and gave Odessa a half-smile, polite but empty. We understand you're claiming part ownership of this bank, he said, already flipping through her documents like they were museum artifacts. I'm just here to verify and advise our client on next steps. Odessa didn't flinch. I'm not claiming anything. I'm here to reclaim what my grandfather built. Hanley glanced at Lyles. We'll need copies of all this. Originals can't leave the premises, but we'll digitize them for analysis. Odessa didn't answer right away. Instead, she pulled a folded letter from her purse. The paper was creased, its ink feathered at the edges, but the signature at the bottom was clear. Elijah Jenkins, she said, laying it in front of them. He wrote this in 1961, said he feared they'd come for what was his, and they did. Hanley read the letter. then passed it to the woman beside him. You expect us to believe your grandfather was muscled out of his own bank, and no one noticed? Odessa's eyes narrowed just slightly. No one who wanted to notice. You think those early shareholders kept clean books? The Jenkins family went from majority owners to nothing in under 10 years. And nobody asked how, because no one cared. We weren't the kind of family people made statues for. Lyles shifted in his seat, but the Hamilton name, Elijah and Ernest were partners. Odessa interrupted built this place in the 30s, but only one of them was given credit. Guess which one got written into the history? Hanley scratched the back of his neck. Even if all of this is true, you'd need to prove continuity of ownership. Paper trails, tax filings. They're all in that sack. Odessa said, I've been filing claims with county officers since I was 28. Every year, every decade. Even after my husband died quietly, patiently. Because my grandfather told me one day, the truth will be heavier than the lies. The room fell quiet. The younger attorney, a woman named Selina Miles, looked up from a typed ledger. This is extensive. Where do you even find some of these? In a church basement, in my uncle's attic, in city archives that didn't know what they had. I spent most of my retirement putting it all together. Hanley wasn't smiling anymore. He tapped his pen on the table. You understand this could spark a lawsuit. I'm counting on it. Odessa said there was no bravado in her voice, just truth. She hadn't come for charity. She came because she had receipts. Lyles, who had been silent for a while, leaned forward finally. Miss Jenkins, why now? Odessa paused before answering. Because you all laughed. She said it without venom. Just fact. I walked in with a history no one bothered to remember. I watched the name Jenkins erased from every annual report, every plaque for years. I told myself it didn't matter. But this place, it's built on what my grandfather started, on what we lost. And after all these years, after all the waiting, I figured it's time someone remembered. Hanley rubbed his eyes. We're going to need to bring in senior counsel. Good, Odessa said, sliding the last sheet across the table. They'll want to see this. It was a black ledger, smaller than the rest, handwritten in tight, neat lines. Ernest's private account book. She said, found it in a box marked receipts in a retired accountant's garage in Madeira. Shows every transfer, every dividend, every time Jenkins shares were reallocated without our consent. Hanley looked like he'd swallowed a rock. Selina covered her mouth. You're telling me this was hidden? No, Odessa said it was forgotten, which is worse. But as the attorneys leaned in to study the ledger, none of them saw what Odessa saw through the glass. The face of someone, recording everything from their phone, standing just outside the door. The video was already on its way to the wrong inbox. By the time anyone inside the room noticed, a bank employee, young, maybe 20, to name tag flipped backward, had paused just long enough outside the glass to catch 30 seconds of Odessa's quiet revolution. A woman with a weathered face and a ledger in her hand, calmly flipping through decades of erased truth. Inside, Bryce Hanley squinted at the document in front of him, like it might catch fire. This ledger changes things. Odessa didn't reply. She let the silence stretch until someone else broke it. It was the assistant manager. Lyles, his throat dry. That's Ernest Hamilton's handwriting. We keep samples for verification. That's his. Selina nodded. And these aren't just notes. These are unauthorized adjustments, dividend transfers, forged proxy votes, even ghost shareholders. Hanley leaned back in his chair. We'll need to shut down access to internal systems until we understand how deep this goes. The board's going to want to see all of this. Odessa tilted her head slightly. The board's going to need to answer for all of it. He ignored that. How did you get this? I asked the right people, paid visits, sent letters. Most folks were either too old to care or too guilty to talk. But one man, a retired CPA named Douglas Nunn in Madeira, kept boxes he was never told to burn. Hanley scribbled in his notebook, frustration starting to crack through his corporate con. We could be looking at corporate liability. breach of fiduciary duty, misrepresentation of historical records. Odessa cut in, and theft, that word rang out like someone had dropped it from the ceiling. Nobody called it that at the time, she continued. They just called it a rebranding. But when you change names and hide hands, it's still stealing. Selena looked between the pages. This has fingerprints all over it. Old checks, forged board minutes, skipped filings during the consolidation years. The regional director arrived mid-sentence. Her name was Diane Cole, late 40s, red blazer, hair sharp enough to draw lines on a chalkboard. She strode in with the gait of someone used to being in charge. "Brief me," she said, her eyes already scanning the room. Hanley stood. "Miss Jenkins has presented extensive documentation of family ownership dating back to the bank's founding, including this ledger, private accounts, likely Hamilton's detailing unauthorized share transfers." Cole picked up the ledger like it was made of bones. She flipped through it fast, then slowed down at a dog-eared page, her brow furrowed. "Is this real?" Odessa looked her dead in the eye. "You tell me." Cole sat down, set the ledger aside, and folded her hands. "Miss Jenkins, if this is what it appears to be, it could spark state investigations, maybe federal. Do you understand the scope of what you're sitting on?" "I do. I've lived with it for decades." Cole turned to Hanley. "What's our exposure?" He hesitated. "If this ledger is authenticated, and it will be, it's not just PR, it's shareholder fraud, historical misrepresentation, and likely a legacy of financial discrimination. We may have to notify regulatory bodies." Lyle, quiet until now, said under his breath, "We could lose the charter." Odessa finally leaned forward. "I didn't come to shut it down. I came to make it honest." They looked at her like she was speaking another language. "You think I want your jobs, your titles," she said. "My grandfather didn't build this place, so I could tear it down, but I won't let it sit on a lie any longer." Cole nodded slowly. "You're not asking for a check, are you?" "No." Odessa said, "I'm asking for my family's name to be put back where it belongs, on the records, on the wall, on the founding documents. And if it can't be done, I'll let the courts do it for me." For a moment, no one moved. Then Hanley stood. "I'm going to call headquarters, and I suggest we stop pretending this is just a misunderstanding." Selena gathered the papers gently, as if handling history itself. Outside the door, phones were lighting up. Word had spread. A local reporter was already downstairs, asking questions about the elderly woman claiming to own the bank. Cole looked out the window, then back at Odessa. "You sure you're ready for this to get ugly?" Odessa gave a small smile. "Baby, I've lived through ugly. I'm ready for true." But while the building braced for legal storms, Odessa knew something deeper was coming, because justice has a way of echoing beyond courtrooms. By the time the sun dipped behind the rows of office buildings in downtown Modesto, the story had already left the bank's walls. A journalist from the Valley Record stood outside the glass doors with a notepad and a camera. Her name was Alana Cruz, mid-30s, blunt haircut, no-nonsense voice. She hadn't been sent. She'd come on her own, after hearing whispers from a cousin who worked in the building. Inside, people were moving differently. Staff who had scoffed that morning were now tight-lipped, rushing papers between offices and avoiding Odessa's gaze. Others, mostly younger tellers, looked at her with a strange kind of awe, like they were just now realizing they might be working in a building built on someone else's stolen story. Cole stood near the windows, arms folded, watching it all unfold like a chess game. She hadn't expected to play today. "She's going to want a statement," she said, nodding toward the reporter. Odessa didn't look up from her seat. "Let her in, are you sure?" "Let her in," she repeated. "I'm not hiding." Moments later, Alana stepped into the conference room, camera slung around her shoulder, recorder already running. "I'm told you've got proof. This bank doesn't own what it says it does." Odessa didn't flinch. "I've got proof it never did." "Not completely. And you are Odessa Bell Jenkins, granddaughter of Elijah Jenkins, the man who co-founded this institution and was written out of history without so much as a footnote." Alana sat across from her. "That's a bold claim." "It's not a claim. It's a record." Odessa said, "Everything you need's on that table." The reporter glanced at Cole. "Is this being taken seriously?" Cole exhaled, tension in her shoulders. "You're not doing this for money." Odessa smiled, tired. "Child, if I wanted money, I could have sold these documents to a lawyer years ago, but what's money to a legacy?" Hanley, still on the phone across the room, hung up. "Headquarters." has agreed to begin the internal investigation. Proceedings effective immediately. And the founder's plaque? Odessa asked. Cole spoke this time. We'll order a replacement with both names, Hamilton and Jenkins. Good. Odessa said, her voice flat. But I want the old one sent to me. My grandfather's name should never have been erased in the first place. Alanna jotted something in her notebook. Do you think this story will inspire others? Odessa gave a small laugh. I don't care if it inspires. I care if it wakes folks up. Families get robbed all the time. Not with guns, but with silence paper. Silence nobody questions. A missing signature if the person missing looks like me. Outside the story had already begun spreading online. A few photos, a short clip of Odessa placing the ledger on the table, dozens of comments, hundreds of shares, people asking questions about Hamilton, First Bank's history, people wondering how many other names were erased for comfort. Inside the bank's lobby was quiet, not from shame, but from recognition. Cole stood adjusting her blazer. We'll release a public statement within the next 24 hours. A formal apology and an offer for partnership should Miss Jenkins accept. Odessa looked out the window. The street lights flicked on below. Across the street the post office was already closed. She wondered what her mother would have thought if she'd lived to see this. I'm not here for a deal, she said. I'm here to put my grandfather's name back in the light. And if you folks have the decency to do that without another legal battle, I'll call that a start. But the apology would only matter if people remembered why it was necessary. And that part was up to more than just the bank. By morning the world outside had caught up. The story was on the front page of the Valley Record, spreading across timelines and talk shows. Odessa Bell Jenkins, the woman who walked into a bank with a sack and walked out with history. Headlines love to make it sound simple, but what Odessa carried wasn't just history. It was memory, stitched together with pain, patience and proof. The bank issued a public statement just before noon. They called it a failure of historic accuracy and a deeply regrettable omission in the bank's founding recognition. Lawyers had reviewed enough to know it wasn't just an oversight. It was a pattern, and it had taken one woman and one sack to crack it. Wide open inside her modest home just outside Ceres, Odessa sat in her favorite chair, a chipped mug of coffee between her palms. The sack, now nearly empty, lay folded on the coffee table. Next to it sat the old ledger and a new brass nameplate, Jenkins and Hamilton Founders, delivered by a courier. It's ground. Her neighbor Mr. Ridgway, a retired mechanic who used to wave but never talk much, showed up with banana bread and asked if she'd consider speaking at the local college. Odessa chuckled. Let me catch my breath first, she told him, but inside something was different. Not pride exactly, not revenge either. Peace. Because sometimes the hardest part isn't exposing what was done to you, it's waiting long enough for someone to care that it happened. 3 days later, the bank hosted a private ceremony in their newly renamed Jenkins Hamilton Founders Hall. Odessa arrived in a navy blue suit and the same straw hat. She didn't smile for the cameras, didn't shake hands like a politician. She stood in front of the new plaque, ran her fingers across her grandfather's name, and whispered, "You're home now." Alanna Cruz attended to capturing photos and conversations. For a follow-up piece, she asked Odessa afterward what advice she'd give to others with a history hidden under dust and silence. Don't wait for permission to tell your story. Odessa said some folks won't want to hear it. That doesn't make it less true. As guests began to leave, a young teller, the same one who had laughed that first day, walked up to her quietly. His name was Daniel Ortiz. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I didn't know you didn't want to," Odessa replied gently. "But now you do." He nodded. "You changed the way I see this place." "Thank you." She gave him a slow look. "Now change how you treat the next person who walks in here with something to say outside." The wind kicked up and rattled the doors as they closed behind her. The sun was warm. Odessa's shoulders felt light. For the first time in a long time, she didn't come to destroy anything. She came to uncover what should have never been buried, not out of anger, but out of love. Love for a man who taught her that truth is patient. Love for a family who deserved better. Love for every person who's ever been erased, because they weren't easy to remember. In the weeks that followed, other families began stepping forward, asking questions about land deeds, property losses, misfiled ownership records from decades past. Odessa didn't plan to lead a movement, but her story had already lit a fuse. Because once people realize the silence isn't accidental, they start listening differently. And once they start listening, the world shifts. So if you're sitting on a truth the world forgot, this story is for you. Don't let it rot in a drawer or die in your memory. Speak it, protect it, and pass it down. Because sometimes, if you enjoy stories with unexpected twists, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because the next character might be you.